So today we have Matthew Godsoe, Director from Public Safety Canada. He has been acting as the advisor and reviewer of the summary for policymakers. Kathryne Forge from the Director of, Executive Lead of Disaster Risk Reduction from Emergency Management, BC. Kathryne has been a great supporter right from the beginning and throughout the process, supporter and great advisor at every step. We have Laurie Daniels, who is a professor at Department of Forest and Conservation Sciences, University of British Columbia. Laurie and Steve Taylor are co-authors of the wildfire article, have done an amazing job there. And we have Caroline Jackson, who is a Director of Climate Action at Natural Systems and Biodiversity Unit of the District of North Vancouver. Caroline is a new friend, at least new friend to me. I know she is well known to the community. So this panel is about the governance. And I want to start with just a few words based on how Sendai framework defines governance as one of the fundamental pieces and components for doing disaster risk reduction effectively. Having a clear vision, plans, competencies, guidance, and coordination of all actors. With that, I would like to invite our speakers to start with their short opening remarks. We start with Matt, Kathryne, Caroline, and then Laurie. Matt, please go ahead.
Thanks. I'm going to set a timer for myself because I feel like I'm perennially talking too much. So I'll do my best to stop that. But just
we'll help you with that.
So, as you mentioned, I'm from Public Safety Canada. I'm here to help, which I'm sure causes some consternation in various folks around the room. But regardless, maybe I can zoom out and give you the view, I think, from a federal standpoint on why governance is so important and what's changing in our risk environment. So many of you are acutely aware of some of the disaster trends that we've been seeing in the past few decades. And one of the things that's most important in terms of those trends is the ways in which our risk environment has been moving forward in nonlinear steps. So before the mid-1990s, we really only had 3 disasters in Canadian history that exceeded $500 million in adjusted disaster losses. And then in 1996, we had the Saguenay River flood. In 1997, we had the Red River flood. In 1998, we had the ice storm. And that was one of those steps in our disaster risk profile, because every year since the mid-1990s, we've had at least one $500 million disaster. We reached another step in the early 2010s. Every year since then, on average, we've had at least $1 billion disaster. And we're all looking with a certain amount of critical perspectives to the last couple of years where we've had some major catastrophic events that even blow that $1 billion disaster mark out of the water. We know that these kinds of economic increases in disaster costs can only increase in these stepped nonlinear increases for so long before we start to see higher and higher disaster-related morbidity and mortality events. So although we talk a lot about the economics now, I think one of the shifts that we need to make from a governance standpoint is recognizing that those economic costs are sort of a proxy for the kinds of disaster-related morbidity and mortality and psychosocial impacts that we need to be preparing for into the future. We also have a system that's built largely on legacy code. And when I say that, I mean a lot of the governance structures, a lot of the constructs that we are using are constructs that are from the 1970s and 80s, and they've been repurposed and we put band-aids on them for the last few decades. And they work fairly well for discrete events. They work fairly well for small and medium-sized disaster events, and we've made them work for large-scale disaster events as well. But there comes a size of disaster event where the disaster itself undergoes a bit of a qualitative shift. And the kinds of solutions that we've applied in the past, the kinds of governance structures that served us well for those small and medium scale events are actually incredibly maladaptive for catastrophic scale disasters. And we're getting closer and closer to regular encounters with those types of catastrophic scale events, which don't respect internal geographic boundaries or international boundaries, and are really about looking at a complex systems-based solution to solve for the kinds of risks that we're likely to see into the future. That's where the UN definitions of disaster risk reduction and our collective federal, provincial, and territorial implementation of those interpretations through the emergency management strategy for Canada becomes so important. Because this was the first explicit recognition among FPT governments about the need for a whole of society approach to deal with those catastrophic scale risks, which we know are continuing to increase in probability into the future. And so from a federal standpoint, obviously, or at least from Public Safety Canada's standpoint, obviously so supportive of this work and the ways in which it operationalizes that whole of society approach, the alignment with the UN Sendai framework, as well as with the emergency management strategy. So congratulations to the team who's worked on this. We just think that it's, like I said, a great way of operationalizing and making concrete and real so many of the concepts that we've been trying to advance from a higher level governance perspective. So look forward to engaging in this conversation, look forward to seeing where the next steps of the report go, and look forward to continuing to collaborate and trying to implement that whole of society approach to disaster risk reduction. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And it was perfectly within the 3 minutes. Thank you. Kathryne, please go ahead.
Great. Thanks so much, Sahar. And thanks, Matt. So I'm Kathryne Forge, joining from the traditional territory of the Waskanik people. And I think for us here within BC, we're in a really unique time right now because we have the opportunity and are modernizing our emergency management legislation. And that's really a once in a lifetime opportunity. And that's what really stems or sets the groundwork for governance here in BC as it relates to disaster risk. And so this legislation hasn't been updated in decades. And so right now, the influences and the drivers that are going to be making the change within that legislation is, of course, the United Nations Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, of which the province adopted in 2018, but also the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. That's something that the BC government passed in 2019, our own Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, and that represents a significant milestone in our province's journey towards reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. And then I would say a third major influence on the direction of where it is that we're going and what it is that we need to incorporate, not just our legislation, but also our policies and our programs, is of course climate change and the need for us to adjust to future risk as it relates to climate change. And so those key drivers are the backdrop for the transition that's been underway right now in that modernization of our Emergency Program Act. And so with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, it's important to note this is a legal requirement that's been created through that act for us to engage and co-develop our legislation with Indigenous peoples. And so there have been a few pieces of co-developed legislation since the act was passed in 2019, but this will be the first major piece of legislation to be co-developed with Indigenous partners. And so that entails that we've been having frequent technical meetings, generally weekly or bi-weekly for the majority of this year with representatives from First Nations Leadership Council and the Alliance of BC Modern Treaty Nations. And then we've also had policy discussions and validations of the proposed policies with rights and title holders, so representatives of First Nations governments. And then we've also had policy discussions with Métis Nation BC and Indigenous service providers like the BC Association of Aboriginal Friendship Centers and First Nations Health Authority. And I can't stress enough how critical that this process has been for us in that co-development, but also for our learning and to make sure that what it is that we're setting within our legislation is something that's going to have legacy for years to come. Especially as I mentioned, this is a once in a lifetime opportunity for us to set that governance and direction for us as a province. And so, of course, the other piece that's a main influencer is again the United Nations Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. And so we're weaving into the fabric of that new legislation how it is that we need to look at risk assessments, risk governance, the importance of partnerships. So definitely the promotion of regional partnerships and other partnerships, and looking at a shared responsibility model with an all of society approach. And then of course, climate change. So we're all very experienced now with the severity and frequency of disasters that have been coming from extreme weather events. And so it's really changing how it is that we focus on our work and looking at that future risk. So recognizing that linkage between climate change and the hazard landscape. And so certainly the events of the last few years have really underscored that need, the extreme weather events that we've had, the extreme heat event last year, the wildfires, and of course the atmospheric river event in November, a very tough year for us in 2021. And so with that, we're ensuring that that legislation is going to be better rounded in that it takes those pieces into account, but it's also has a more deliberate approach about the 4 phases of emergency management. Right now, our current legislation really focuses primarily on response with some aspects of preparedness. And so really wanting to build in mitigation and recovery. And so those pieces are being built in. The All of Society approach, so looking at critical infrastructure owners and their roles within disaster risk and emergency management, recognizing the important role of volunteers, recognizing plural and dynamic forms of Indigenous governments, and agreements for co-management and shared decision-making with Indigenous governing bodies. So I'll leave it there. I might actually be a little bit over time there, Sahar, but it's very time for us. So, for us to be able to make some of that meaningful change and really set that strategic direction for our future as it relates to disaster risk and emergency management.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Carolyn, please go ahead.
Hi, everyone. I'm so pleased to be here today to share a little bit of our perspective here at the District of North Vancouver, and congratulations to the authors and to everyone involved in preparing this report. There's really a lot of wisdom, I think, to be shared and in it, and appreciate the opportunity to be here today. Some of the aspects that really resonated with me were some of the points around empowering collaboration amongst various actors. And we all know we can't get there on our own. And I guess that's what we're doing here today, is just really sharing our individual perspectives and knowledge and working together. And one of the other aspects of the report for me was just acknowledging the important, as we sort of have been discussing, the shifting role of emergency management offices. And last year, our emergency management office here at the district, just at the height of the pandemic, during the pandemic, they're responding, they're being deployed, they're responding to forest fires, and we have a heat dome, and then we have a flood event, and all of the other usual things that happen. But really, this office is expected in the midst of more and more emergencies. I think we used to get one of those every 5 years, and now we have multiple emergencies in any given year. But they're also in the midst of this expected to shift to more proactive planning. So I think it's a real challenge for these folks, but I think there's lots of other actors in the organization that are, or in our organizations, that are available to really support these folks in that work and really collaborate together. The other thing for me that was really resonated was some of the elements around monitoring mechanisms and just monitoring and reporting on the impacts of policies. I think, coming from the climate action space, on the mitigation side of, reducing emissions, it can be challenging, but it's a little bit more straightforward to measure whether or not your emissions are going down. Whereas, with adaptation and resilience, it's a little bit more challenging, and maybe because of that, we don't do as much monitoring and reporting in that area as we do. But it's really critically important to grow our understanding and to understand whether or not we're on track. I just wanted to speak really briefly of some of the work that we're doing here at the district. We have a hazard mitigation program. We have 30 creeks, and our stormwater system wasn't really built to withstand the tree limbs, the rocks, and the debris that are now washing down the mountains during our winter storms. So that's one of our key pieces of work, has been establishing debris barriers and a risk-based approach there. We have a wildfire protection plan where we do fuel management in the fire interface areas we work. It's really collaboration between the fire department, the parks department, the planning department to move this work forward. And just most recently on the building side, there was a lot around the building code. Of course, as local governments, we don't set the building code, but we do have an influence during the rezoning process. And so recognizing the impact of the heat dome and some of the coroner's report recommendations, we recently established a climate ready building policy that requires essentially expects if projects are going through rezoning that they incorporate mechanical and passive cooling and air filtration requirements. And then just finally, I wanted to mention with some help from the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions, we had an intern this summer who did a review of the implementation of our climate adaptation plan, and it kind of identified some gaps and some barriers to us as a local government in implementing our climate adaptation plan. And a lot of that was actually staff turnover and a lack of institutional memory, the roles and responsibilities not always being clear, and a lack of clear indicators to measure success. So I think a lot of that could be overcome through establishing clear monitoring and reporting mechanisms, different levels of government, and empowering collaboration. The last thing I just wanted to mention was, of course, we're always struggling with the lack of funding, but I think for local governments, it's exacerbated in part by the fact that much of our funding is grant-based, and so the local governments that have the staff and that have the opportunity to apply for these grants typically are the ones that get the grants. And one of the great things that the province has done recently is established a local government climate action program, which provides every local government in BC with a base level of climate action funding for mitigation and for adaptation. And that's really going a long way. It's essentially based on population, but there's a minimum amount that you get as a local government. And I think more mechanisms like that are where we need to go, because we're in, let's just face it, we're in a climate emergency and we need to move, we need to move fast. And, we have to try and figure out ways to reduce the bureaucracy and get the work done. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Caroline. Lori, please go ahead.
Thanks, Sahar. And I'm going to share some slides with the group. Oh, sorry, that's not gone to the right slide. There we go. So thank you for the invitation to be here. I'm coming to you today from Treaty 6 territory, where I'm in Edmonton for the Canada Wildfire International and National Meeting. I wanted to share with you this morning this video of wildfire and its impacts both on ecosystems and communities. As an example, this amazing video was taken by Adrian Wagner from the community of Nelson, British Columbia in the heat of the summer of 2015. So I am one of the co-authors of the wildfire chapter alongside Dr. Steve Taylor and Kelby Forbes from NRCan and Dr. Kelsey Copes-Gervitz, who works with me at UBC. As we have experienced in British Columbia, in the last 5 years, we've had 3 of the worst wildfire seasons that have impacted British Columbia in over a century. We've burned almost 3.5 million hectares of forest. We've spent $4 billion trying to put those forest fires out with tremendous social and ecological impacts. So the timing of this report and the urgency of this issue, I think, cannot be understated. I want to pick up on some of the points that the panelists have already made and illustrate them with wildfire as an example, in particular, drawing from some of our findings that are in the report itself. So we know that there are gaps and challenges, and in particular for wildfire, it's a very complex problem. In part, we know these fires are being driven by climate change, the heat of the summer, the heat dome, the prolonged droughts. Even for us to be having 50 wildfire starts in the month of October of 2022, and for us to be consuming smoke in our atmosphere for much of the month of October is unprecedented and speaks to the impacts of climate change lengthening our fire seasons. They're starting earlier with the heat domes in 2017 and 2021, and extending longer into the fall, as we saw in 2018 and this year in 2022. But climate change is also superimposed on a landscape that has changed tremendously over the last century. And those landscape changes result from changes in Indigenous land stewardship, colonization and changes in land management towards grazing, industrial forestry, other changes in land use, And then also our response, our immediate response to fire has always been that it's a damaging agent that needs to be controlled. And so fire suppression has also contributed to creating a landscape that today is highly vulnerable to fire. The mural on the left shows what we call the era of mega fires, where we see these fires burning at landscape levels with tremendous impacts. We see communities that are not yet well adapted to those fires, where we need additional mitigation at landscape and local levels, and homeowners, where we have homes that are not yet adapted to fire through either building materials, landscaping, and then individuals, our citizens, who are not well versed in the fire-prone environments in which they live. And we're a little bit lulled by our success in being able to detect and put out fires in the past. We've been so successful in mitigating in our emergency responses that our expectation has been that fires can be detected and suppressed in a short period of time. The combination of climate change and the changes in our landscape mean that that is no longer true, as we have been experiencing in recent years. So our challenges then are to work across these multiple scales and multiple jurisdictions, anywhere from homeowners to municipalities, regional districts, provincial governments, federal governments, and of course, Indigenous communities, all of whom are being impacted and all of whom need to be that whole of society approach. We've identified then across these different scales the challenges that need to be addressed and some gaps. The lack of integration across scales, the need for developing and testing management strategies, and has already been identified today, also coupled with that, the monitoring of both their effectiveness and their efficacy in advance of being challenged by future fires. Gaps in policy and guidance for best practices are proving to be barriers for many communities, and then needing support for highly innovative approaches. As we move towards reconciliation and incorporating the principles of UNDRIP at the provincial and federal levels, we need to also move forward in those positive ways to incorporate Indigenous knowledge, but also local communities into solutions where they have that expertise at the local level. And enhancing capacity is critical so that we can implement the new policy and practice. So in our wildfire chapter, as an example of the complexity of these issues, we posed multiple opportunities and ways in which we can achieve resilience to wildfire at the landscape and community level by making those changes to governance, to policy and practice. The key will be integration across these multiple organizations to meet the pillars of emergency response, the mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. That multi-scale approach, starting right down at the level of the homeowners to become better prepared, versed in programs like Fire Smart that can be implemented at the homeowner and community scale, and then working up to the landscapes where we have both communities, individual municipalities, First Nations communities, and regional districts working alongside the provincial government to come up with solutions. We know as well in British Columbia, it's complex in part because so much of our land is Crown land, and we have two different services that have worked as silos, the BC Wildfire Service working in emergency response to fire, and then the BC BC Forest Service actually managing the lands in the forest that contribute so much to the fuels that make our communities vulnerable. So breaking those silos and integrating our responses with policy change is really critical. Building that capacity for innovative response, including, and here's the irony, fire being part of the solution to our fire problem, the paradox that we put out fires contributing to the problem, and that managed, prescribed, and cultural fire are all parts of the solution on this landscape. Perhaps fire is one of the rare hazards where it is both a problem and a solution simultaneously. And to achieve that, we do need that multi-year sustained funding to make sure that mitigation treatments are being implemented across all community types and providing enhanced support for those local and First Nation governments who are really doing the heavy lifting towards achieving those goals. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lori. So as expected, it seems like human nature. There's no way to stick to the time. So we are already behind. I do have a series of questions that I wanted to originally ask every one of you to answer, but we do need to shift a little bit. I'll ask the question because some of you have already addressed some of the issues in the questions that I'm going to ask. So please let me know if you have a burning response that you want to provide to a question. So we're not going to ask every one of you to answer, but the first one of the recommendations, one of the first key recommendation of the report is that we need strategies in the resilience world that have measurable targets with indicators and monitoring mechanism so that we can monitor the progress, learn the lessons, and adjust the course. Right now, that's not part of the practice in the resilience world. As Kathryne mentioned, it's more common on the mitigation, climate mitigation side. So I want to hear your views on the importance of having targets and monitoring mechanisms. Why do you think, what the barriers are, and how can we make that shift to make it a culture, make it part of the practice in the resilience side? Who would want to go first? Matt, Kathryne? It's not a burning issue for any of you. Even if it's not burning, I would like to hear your thoughts on, because it's challenging, right? Setting out measurable targets and indicators, wide range of indicators would be needed. Go ahead, please.
Briefly, I think this was one of the biggest aspects of our recent review of our adaptation strategy implementation. And really, I think part of the reason we don't have them is because it's very challenging to find the data. But I do think it's quite critical to collaborate in terms of identifying what some of those things can be, even if they're not perfect. I know when we were working through, we had originally, I think, 60 indicators for our plan, but did we have data that we maintained every year on them? No. So I think that's where you need to kind of look at what are those key things to measure and understand that it's not going to be perfect, but it's a start. Those are my comments.
Great. Thank you so much. Matt, go ahead.
I think there's two sides of this that are interesting and noteworthy. The first one is, I think we're on the precipice of getting our fingers on regularly updated data to help substantiate some of this tracking and monitoring over time. So just in looking at the ways that we're able to actually view strategic and enduring flood risk year over year, seismic risk year over year, I know that the Wildland Urban Interface Fire National Strategic Risk Assessment work is also progressing. That opens the door to actually being able to meaningfully measure the outcomes and not just the activities, which I think is like what we ought to be caring most about. So I think that that's really exciting, just knowing where we are now on the modeling front. That's going to open up, I think, a lot more evidence-based policy in the emergency management domain as the field itself kind of shifts from more of a practitioner-focused domain to a more combined one that has better access to analytics. The flip side to that, though, is it's the old saying, and maybe it's not even that old, but culture eats strategy for breakfast. So I think we need to be a little bit leery of the fact that, as Lori mentioned, it's a complex problem. It's a complex adaptive system. It's a lot easier to find indicators than it is to actually find indicators that are meaningful in the full complexity of the messiness of the problem itself. So I think we ought to absolutely set targets and leverage the new and emergent data as it comes forward, but also I think a bit of a critical eye to making sure that the target doesn't become the objective, thinking about how we support the full breadth of the complexity of the problem. And, bureaucratic organizations are bad at dealing with indicators that they don't have full control over. And I think that that's where you need to be careful about the full complexity of the problem versus the institutional ability to sign off on something. I think that it's going to be a bit of a push and pull in the coming years.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. If there is no other, Lori, please go ahead.
Yeah, may I add? So I really want to follow up with Matthew's comments because they're so important. Here in British Columbia, we have faced catastrophic fire multiple times in the last 20 years. And after 2003, we did a review in 2004 that made many recommendations. And we did identify as early as 18 years ago, that we have 1.6 million hectares of forests surrounding communities in British Columbia. So this is immediately in the wildland-urban interface that put communities at risk of wildfire. Many of those are in environments with extreme and high fire danger during the summertime, both because of the fuel loads and the types of fire weather that those communities experience. And here we are 18 years into provincially and locally funded projects, and we've really only addressed 10% of that problem. So it's important that we know where the problems are, that we begin to address them, but the urgency of moving forward on the climate emergency cannot be understated. We need to find ways to motivate and act and really ensure that our actions are addressing these urgent needs in a timely way. So I would love to see us in British Columbia moving much more quickly. I was recently informed at a workshop just last week with our Community Forest Association that we are now treating, directly treating 8,000 hectares per year for fuels mitigation treatments. So that's 18 years into an urgent problem. We've made it to 8,000 hectares per year out of 1.6 million hectares that need to be addressed. So we really need to both not only identify these problems, we know the solutions, but we need to make sure that they're being implemented in a high priority way. There are many ways that we could fast track those treatments, and we need to make that a high priority moving forward.
Thank you, Lori. Kathryne, please go ahead. And let's please, all of us, make the comment, make the responses short, because I just see the time ticking. Go ahead, Kathryne, please.
Yeah, well, so I will say, I think the indicators part of the strategy is something it's so critically important. And I think it's something that we could all do better on. I think the understanding what it is that we're actually driving towards in order to be able to improve, that's a measurable that I think is often challenging, right? Especially when you're in response or even when you're in recovery. And we built indicators into the recovery framework, and they still had to be validated. But that was to really understand, how do we know it when a community actually is in recovery or has surpassed certain milestones as it relates to recovery, to know that we're improving. But then about the measurable and then improving, just going back to Matt's comments about data, that without us being able to have baseline data, I mean, that's just a standard for us to be able to understand also then if it is that we're improving and if it is that we're actually reducing disaster risk. So one of the things that we're really pushing forward is that access to data, hazard and risk data, and being able to make it open and being able to make it transparent and being able to encourage collaborations and partnerships so that that data can be shared, that has been accessed either through different grants or through different sciences and projects. So definitely something that for us is a priority.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. The next question is related to the governance challenges, especially the silos within different units, inside an institution or among the ministries at different levels of the government. And a component of that is also one of the recommendations from the report in merging disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation at all levels, considering the huge level of commonality that are between the two. I would like to hear your views, your experiences about the silos, maybe good examples of how it has been managed, and your views about the merging of disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. You can pick one of the issues to address. Go ahead, Kathryne.
Yes, thanks for that, Sahar. I can't underscore how important it is about redesigning those mechanisms to merge DRR and climate change adaptation. I mean, I touched on it before in my intro, just the extreme weather events and the knowledge that we absolutely have to plan for future risk as it relates to climate change, and that needs to be incorporated into everything that we do. So looking at how it is that we approach our investments in DRR and our policies with climate change as the main influencer, looking at governance, financing, information and data analysis, capacity development and monitoring. So with that, we've definitely made some changes as it relates to primarily our funding programs on the disaster mitigation side. And so we've expanded disaster mitigation to also have climate change adaptation within its policy direction. And so with that, some of the tangibles are that we're shifting from a single hazard approach to building in that longer term resilience to natural hazards and climate change. we're requiring climate change considerations and applications, planning and design. We're also increasing consideration of natural infrastructure as an alternative to traditional gray infrastructure approaches like hard dikes and infrastructure. And then we're also considering new risks or increasing severity and frequency of risks due to the changing climate. So with that, extreme heat events and opening up funding programs specific for extreme heat, and then also a more severe rainfall. So with us, it's a no-brainer for us to merge these two together. And yeah, I'm actually very motivated by that partnership.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kathryne. Matt.
I just couldn't agree more. Like, fundamentally, from my perspective, there's no difference that makes a difference between disaster risk reduction and climate adaptation if they're effective. And I think that both disciplines come to the table recognizing the problem of siloing, and both are equally guilty of then perpetuating the silos. Some of that is as a result of the way that we fund these things. A first question that gets asked in the public sector when somebody's looking for new money is, how is this not like what we're already spending money on? And it really forces arbitrary distinctions among very complementary pieces of work. So as part of the governance challenge, I think there's not just the intergovernmental challenge across different orders of government, there's also the within government challenge of how do you actually deal with complex problems that require integrated solutions. And I think that we ought to be emphasizing both elements of that governance challenge.
Great. Thank you so much. Lori.
Yeah, and I'll briefly provide an example maybe from wildfire and forest management. I think we have a very good, strong understanding of how some of the changes we need to make at landscape levels and community levels to achieve wildfire risk reduction. In many cases, the principles of ecological restoration, which are also forms of climate adaptation, will work in those cases. The catch is that our management framework currently for managing our timber harvesting land base, the 60% of productive forests that drive our economy in British Columbia, are working on a model that's very different from where we need to go from a climate adaptation and risk reduction perspective. So it means truly transformative change. A true paradigm shift in the way that we manage our forests for timber production versus wildfire and climate change resilience. And making that shift is tremendously challenging because of the economic costs and the risk that it places for our resource-based communities in the interior BC. Ironically, those are also the communities that are most being impacted by fire. And so this push and pull and the trade-offs make it a very, very complex problem to solve.
Thank you so much. I really can't let go of the third question I have. So I will ask that, and then we go to the audience. And that's about financing. One of the recommendations of the report was that we need proactive, reliable, and flexible financing, which is risk-informed and designed with understanding of the needs of the recipients of that funding, especially at the local level. So for example, today we have funding at the provincial level for heat, managing risk from heat, which is a reaction to the heat dome we had last year. Whereas some of the municipalities have done their strategy, have done their work to know what are their priorities, and heat is not necessarily at the top of their list. They have other priorities. So that's the recommendation that had come forward from a lot of the authors and in a lot of the articles. I want to hear short from Matthew and Kathryne, just shed light on what are the mechanisms today in designing the funding programs and budgets at the federal and provincial level. And how do you think we can improve that process? How the community of practice, research, data collection, or these kind of mechanisms can help directing those, like designing those funding programs to be more risk-informed and aligned with the needs of local level. Matthew, would you like to start there?
Sure. So what to say about funding programs? I think there's a few things. So one is we need to obviously leverage the evidence that we talked about, right? The evidence is increasingly coming online to enable us to target things specifically the highest risk areas. One of the things that we learned, for example, from the assessment of flood risk across the country during the work of the Task Force on Flood Insurance and Relocation is just how highly concentrated flood risk is, where the top 10% of residential properties account for 90% of the risk. And I think that you see that same kind of fat tail distribution on the seismic front, and in the case of a number of different hazards, which is both scary when you think about that heavy level of concentration, but also if you can design effective evidence-based programs, it means that for a relatively limited and targeted scope of risk reduction, you can actually have disproportionately high impacts. So certainly baking in that kind of evidence-based perspective is going to lead to better policy outcomes and a higher return on investment for individual investments. I think the other side of it is that funding programs also need to address perverse incentives and moral hazards that enable the creation of new risk across the country. And I think that for a long time, we've been unwilling or unable to have those conversations about the ways in which approving developments in beautiful areas that happen to be at high risk, there's a lot of pressure to do that on behalf of citizens and developers. There's a lot of pressure for local governments to support that. And yet when the disasters strike, the developer's long gone, the citizens expect assistance from their local governments. The local governments are quickly overwhelmed, at least financially, by the cost, and they get transferred up to provinces and in some cases up to the federal government. I think that we need to look at that entire ecosystem as well, because it's not just enough to provide more funding without fundamentally restructuring some of those incentives among orders of government to make sure that the money is going out in a way that actually leads to a net increase in resilience over time.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that response. Kathryne.
Thanks, Sahar. So what I would say when it comes to funding is that we absolutely need long-term sustainable funding for disaster risk reduction and disaster mitigation. And so for us, through my agency, I can tell you that we seek every opportunity for funding. So whether that's through existing or developing provincial mechanisms, such as some of the programs that we're currently administering, like the Community Emergency Preparedness Fund through UBCM, or pursuing our disaster risk reduction agenda through strategies that are being developed by other ministries or across government, like the climate preparedness and adaptation strategy, right? There's always opportunities in the development of those government priorities. And then I would also say that we always look to leverage federal dollars. So when they make them available through cost share programs. Though that's something that we never want to leave federal dollars on the table by not looking at how it is that the provincial government can contribute to those cost share programs. And so that's definitely other funding mechanisms that we look to. And then we're continually reviewing and adjusting the funding programs to try to emphasize that long-term resilience. And so some of the areas too, I think that are necessary for improvement is with working with our Indigenous partners. So we've listened to feedback over the years from Indigenous nations, organizations, youth and elders, and are working to incorporate that into our policy and programs. And that's come through engagements through a variety of different legislative engagements, as well as strategy engagements like the climate preparedness and adaptation strategy. And so to date, we've made some changes in recognizing elders and knowledge holders as experts and properly compensating them for the expertise that they provide, and shifting eligible activities to include protection and preservation of cultural heritage and food security, as well as changing requirements for information sharing with respect to Indigenous ownership and control of their communities' data and information. So I think that we're always looking at ways to better improve our funding programs, as well as looking at models like Carolyn touched on is there a way for us to front end funding for communities without going through the grant process. While it's great to have grants, one, you need to have long-term sustainable funding to know that those grants will always be available, but two, you need to have the capacity to be able to go through what Carolyn mentioned as the bureaucracy. So we've also worked with Finesse on the First Nations Emergency Services Society, who they're assisting First Nations partners on some of that grant process. So trying to be able to find innovative ways to increase capacity for access to funding within those existing mechanisms, but recognizing that we need to do more and adapt how it is that those funding programs are available to communities, particularly ones that are small, rural, remote, and First Nations.
Thank you so much. So this is my first big apologies to the audience, because we ate up our time for questions from the audience. But please write your questions. We'll keep track. And if you have time at the end of the day, most of our speakers will be with us for the whole day. I've asked the speakers to be prepared to answer this question at the end. And that is the fact that the theme of this event and the report is that we need to reimagine how we are doing disaster and climate risk management. What would be your one key blue sky recommendation for how we need to change the way we do things? And also tell us, actually, if, yeah, I guess we can add that if you're an optimist or pessimist about the way we are moving forward. Matthew, we'll start with you.
Apologies, I am going to have to just jump off here momentarily, but I'm very, very optimistic about our ability to overcome these kind of existential challenges. And I think that we're very close to being in a position to do it and to accelerate in the ways that Lori and the other panelists have kind of pointed out are required. And I think I already led with kind of my vision for the future, which is I don't think that there's a difference that makes a difference between what we're doing in disaster risk reduction and climate adaptation. The sooner that we work more closely together on this, the more we get the economies of scales. We actually have very complementary skill sets, and that's part of my optimism. Is I think a lot of the capacity is there. It's more a coordination problem than it is a capacity problem.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And I know you need to go. Okay. Thank you, Matt. Kathryne, your blue sky change you want to see.
I don't remember when we were talking that you said one thing, Sahar, but maybe just a couple of things.
Sure.
Long-term sustainable funding, definitely dedicated towards risk reduction. That's definitely a solid consideration for me. Collaboration and partnerships, I cannot stress these enough, so critically important for us to be able to advance the DRR agenda. The role of insurance and private sector, there's definitely a need for an increased role, particularly as it relates to the insurance industry. And as far as optimism or being negative, absolutely being optimistic. I mentioned before at the beginning that we're at a very influential time, once in a lifetime opportunity, changing our legislation, incorporating all these incredible influences to be able to actually shape the direction of the province for where it is that we know it needs to go. And though disasters have been really tough for these last several years, it's particularly for those people in the communities that are impacted, it actually helps with shaping of our legislation based on the lessons learned from those events and how it is that we can do better in the future. So.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Caroline, your key recommendation.
Yeah, I think lots of agreement with everything that everyone has said to date. But the one thing I think for us that was the big learning piece was around, as we're seeing sort of a generational shift, a lot of people retiring, a lot of people moving on, and a lot of new folks coming into our organization. I think the time is opportune to ensure that this is part of everyone's job description. And it's really embedded and integrated into everything that we do, so that it's not on one person's desk. It's really integrated into what everyone does in the organization, so we're all going in the right direction.
Excellent. Thank you. Lori.
In the wildfire community, we often talk about learning to coexist and live with fire in a respectful way. It's not going away, like many climate-mediated natural disasters and disturbances. We see the likelihood of those disturbances happening more and more into the future. So that kind of whole of society approach and really a cultural shift away from thinking we're going to stop these to learning how to be adapted and better prepared for them is urgently needed. And maybe our success story that I can share with you just briefly is the community of Logan Lake, who has taken the proactive mitigative actions and managed to stop the Tremont fire on the edge of their community within meters of homes, and yet successfully stop that fire without losing homes or community infrastructure. And I hope that we will have more examples like that in British Columbia and across our nation into the future.
Wonderful.
If I want to, Sahar, I'm going to step in now, and I think we need to close our panel because we've got one more really exciting panel coming up. And I just want to say thank you to our chair, Sahar. Thank you to the great panelists for sharing your insights. And